If your knees look anything like this, or when you're walking around you find that your knees slip into hyperextension easily, this video will be for you. Knee hyperextension, or as it's most commonly known as, genou recurvatum, occurs when the knee extends beyond its normal range of motion. Normal being anywhere from 0 to about 10 degrees. This excessively hyperextended position can occur from loose ligaments, structural imbalances, overcompensating muscles, or something that I don't often see discussed, which is weight distribution, and how our feet create the balance for the rest of our structure upstream. Throughout the course of this video, you're gonna learn how to make your ligaments more tensile, correct muscle imbalances specific to hyperextended knees, and walk away with a lifestyle habit that you can start implementing straight away. Let's get into it. Let's start off with getting an understanding as to why you might have hyperextended knees to begin with. And I wanted to touch on the principle of weight distribution and really where we carry weight in through our feet and how our body tries to create a sense of balance around that. So typically when you're dealing with hyperextended knees, or the knees are kind of almost shifted in behind the ankles, we're gonna find that weight is shifting too much either to the back of the foot or to the forefoot. Now, depending if we're shifting weight to the heels or the forefoot too much is gonna kind of determine what happens upstream. So something you can try right now is get out of your chair if you're sitting down while watching this video and just get an idea as to where weight is on your feet. When you're just standing there, where do you feel like you're carrying most of the weight? Once you get an idea for that, have a look down at your knees, see how they're in that hyperextended position. I would think that's why you're watching this video, and see if that's influencing the hips in any way. Because a lot of the time when you're dealing with hyperextended knees, whether you're favoring weight more to the forefoot or the heels, the pelvis will tend to favor more of this anteriorly tilted position. Now this happens for a lot of reasons, and in this video we're gonna get into some of the nuance as to how to create more midfoot pressure and how we can create a neutral pelvis around that. So not only are we gonna work on correcting the amount of extension that our knees are in, but we're also gonna try to bring more neutrality and balance into the hips. So now that we understand some of the why, let's get into the how. So for this, you're gonna wanna grab a yoga block. A water bottle also works here. Anything that you can pop in between your shin bones. And we're gonna work on integrating things like our hamstrings and adductors off the feedback here. Because a lot of the time when we're dealing with this hyperextended knee, the quads are tending to overdrive the knee extension. And we're gonna wanna think about how we can get the hamstrings more in play to kind of support the knee in this position. So grabbing the tool of your choice, what we're gonna work on is going through I'm just gonna turn around here, going into a hinge position, really trying to sense the hamstrings and kind of this posterior side of everything kind of from the glutes down. Now, first and foremost, what we're gonna wanna think of is the feet and the connection to the floor. Because as I was kind of touching on, if I have too much weight to my heels, that's gonna overextend my knees back like so. But if I'm too much forward here, depending on what's happening upstream, that can also create issues with the amount of knee extension we're getting. So we're gonna wanna just come into midfoot pressure, which you can kind of think is almost like the base of the toes or the knuckle of the toes, as well as the top portion of the heel. So it creates this imaginary triangle. It's also known as like the tripod of the foot. And what we're gonna work on is applying pressure down into the floor, kind of feeling the toes kind of splay out alongside that. And then we're gonna work on going into a hip hinge without allowing the lumbar to go into an excess of flexion. So you have to be mindful that as you're going into the hinge, your lower back isn't rounding out here because this isn't gonna facilitate a length tension into our hamstrings, which is kind of what we're looking for. So we're gonna make sure that the lumbar or the lower back is staying neutral. I'm kind of finding that midfoot pressure and that heaviness into the floor. I feel the hamstrings are on line. Now we're gonna squeeze against the block, keeping the foot pressure. We're gonna start to stand up just to neutral. So we're starting to train this pattern of when I come up into extension and I come into my supported position, my knees have a slight degree of flexion in them. I'm not totally locked out, but I'm also not in this position either. We do want the knees to remain in somewhat of a flexed state relative to this fullness of tension that we have around the legs. And we're just gonna continue to repeat through that, trying to sense the right musculature, kind of integrating into that. And I would work through anywhere between about 10 to 12 reps here. For the second exercise, you can grab yourself a small stool. I'm just gonna use these wood blocks that I have here in the garage, and I'm just gonna pop those down. And what we're gonna work on is building on that principle of gathering tension in through the hamstrings, getting the fullness through the leg. But instead of doing it with both legs, we're gonna start to work into a single leg position. So we're gonna take our back leg onto the stool. And what I want you to first kind of sense is that midfoot pressure on the lead leg. And something that's gonna be important is being mindful that the foot is almost directly underneath your hip. We don't want this to be too far in front, because now I'm gonna be getting into a different stance of movement. And this could potentially be promoting more knee extension at the end range than what we want to start with here. So we'll just make sure that the heel is directly underneath the hip, and we're gonna have a bias towards this lead leg. So try not to be stabilizing on that back foot too much. You can almost think you're gonna be falling forward. And as you kind of commit that bias coming forward, you're probably gonna feel that foot start to get quite active. Now, once we have that foot set, we're gonna work through a very similar motion that we're just doing, but now we're gonna bias a hip rotation. In my case, it's gonna be to the right. My upper body is getting more parallel to the ground, and I'm thinking about pushing this hip bone almost towards the back wall behind me. So I'm getting this fullness kind of through the glute max, as well as in through the hamstrings. And now applying that foot pressure down, keeping the toes splayed, I'm gonna slowly start to stand up and watch my right knee here. That knee is not going to do that. So I'm not going into extension. I'm actually keeping the knee where it is, and I'm allowing my hips to track on top of that knee. Then I'm gonna reset the hips back. I'm gonna try to keep the fullness, not letting myself get heavy into that back leg, keeping the bias forward. It's almost like I'm about to take a step forward, and then we're gonna slowly start to stand up again off of that. This is really gonna help to retrain the musculature in around the hamstrings to support the knee, as well as the pelvis. I'd work through anywhere between 7 to 10 reps on the high end, because we want the tempo to be about 3 to 4 seconds down and then 3 to 4 seconds back up. For this next technique, we are going to work on bringing more reflexivity into the hamstrings. So giving the hamstrings an understanding of how to go through full length and contraction, ideally in a smooth way. Because typically when I have hyperextended knees, when I walk, that is gonna be where it really is gonna show itself, and probably where I'm gonna be most prone to injury or just causing like ligament damage and things that we don't want to happen through the knees. So we wanna think about how we can make the hamstrings more reflexive when we go through things like walking, lunging, sidestepping, whatever it might be. So we're gonna do so through a depth drop. So what this is gonna look like is we're gonna get into that split stance position, very similar to what we were just covering there on the stool. So it's gonna be very similar weight distribution. But we're gonna work on doing a small pulse coming up and then kind of dynamically loading the hamstring on this side. So we're gonna start with a little bit of depth, kind of sensing the hamstrings. I'm gonna take a jump up, and then I'm just gonna allow myself to kind of land back on, ideally this left side. So I'm gonna take a hop, and then I'm gonna load into that left side, thinking about kind of loading from the toe to the heel as I come down. So I'm coming up, I'm trying to keep most of the weight on this lead leg, and my back foot here can touch. It doesn't necessarily just have to be a single balance exercise. That would be a progression. But for now, just kind of get used to rolling from the toe to the heel in a smooth way and kind of finding that depth into the pelvis. This is certainly more of a plyometric exercise, so there is going to be more power and explosivity in it. So I'd work through this anywhere between about 10 to 14 reps on the high end, but making sure that you're loading the right tissues, and then you can start to increase the height and power output as you start to get more familiar with the motion. This last technique is a real simple one. It's a lifestyle habit you can integrate straight away. And that's just bringing more awareness into your body, both when you're standing and when you're walking. You can think when you're standing, just not allowing the knees or weight distribution to be favored too far to the heels, which is gonna bias that excessive extension. As well as when you're walking, just being mindful that you're not excessively heel striking. A lot of the time when you're dealing with an excessive hyperextension of the knee, specifically when walking, it's due to too big of a step and you excessively driving the heel down. So just be mindful of these principles on a day-to-day basis. Be mindful of how big your step is. You can think about rolling kind of more from the central point of the heel rather than the back backside of it and just having a nice smooth kind of roll through the foot to not allow that knee to overly extend, as well as when you're standing, just being mindful that you have some of that midfoot pressure that we're working on today. For a lot of people, having hyperextended knees is something that can be corrected with the right exercises and repetitions over time. If you want to do more of a deep dive on the principles that were covered in this video and look at the relationship between how the hips, knees, and ankles all work together to take us through motion, you can check a video I did on that right here.